Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Curse of Naxxramas. I probably mispronounced it. I'm going to be honest with you. I haven't played a lot of World of Warcraft, but I have been playing a lot of Hearthstone, and that's all that really should matter. For those of you who do not know, there is an expansion coming up very soon, in fact tomorrow, and I just wanted to make a video that's going to have sort of an overview of a lot of the cards, what they do, and give some brief opinions on it. Just to clarify, I am not the best player of Hearthstone, and all of these opinions are probably going to be wildly inaccurate or just contain some weird overall biases. I'm not promising anything important here. Real quick, the background footage is from my latest Hearthstone Arena video. I'm not going to really talk about that too much. If you're interested in it, go watch it. Otherwise, that's going to be the last you ever hear about it. So let's just go ahead and get right into this. I'm going to go ahead and cover the class cards first, the class-specific cards that are going to be coming out. And then I'm going to go ahead and move on to the 22 overall cards that are all class. I'll be touching on the legendaries last just because they will take more time to discuss. And all in all, just want to go ahead and get a nice first impression videos out. So with that said, let's just go right on ahead and move on straight to the very first card, shall we? Which is going to be the Druid card, Poison Seeds. Poison Seeds effect says destroy all minions and summon 2/2 trends to replace them. I don't really know what to think about this card, honestly. It seemed like a pretty bad card when I looked at it at first because you're essentially replacing everything that you had been building up and just giving your opponent's minions, which is, that's not the point of Board Clear. The point of Board Clear is to make sure your opponent doesn't have any minions left, but the more I think about it, this card might see some use in a new kind of Druid deck where maybe you use some of the existing Trent spells and just try to spawn extra Trents. I don't know. Really don't want to spend too much time touching on this one. It'll be interesting to see exactly how this plays out and if anybody can actually get any use out of this card, but all in all, I might have kind of mixed opinions on that one. Next up, we have the Hunter card, Web Spinner, Death Rattle. Draw a random beast card. It is a 1-cost, 1/1 minion that happens to be a beast. This card isn't necessarily bad. I can see it being fit into any sort of Hunter deck, but the real kind of iffy thing about it to me is that if you're playing a beast synergy deck, you're already gonna have a lot of beasts, so this card isn't overly specific, and Flare has a little bit more utility than this, other than the fact that it's, a spell and not a creature on the board, so you can't trigger things like Starving Buzzard or the Hyena, but you also have to kill it yourself, which kind of makes it mostly unreliable as card draw. You can't get the card you need immediately, and it's a little bit hard to do the combo with. The Hunter meta has been kind of falling out anyway, so this card seems to be coming kind of late, but it still seems like a pretty interesting card. Not necessarily a bad card, just nothing to write home about, I think. It will definitely see some use in Beast Synergy, but it's not going to be good at doing anything overly specific unless, say, you want to run a very specific deck with maybe only a few beasts in it, like King Crush. I haven't seen that kind of deck yet. It would be very nice to see that kind of deck. But that's just my opinion. We'll see if it actually has any sort of use outside of that, and does anything besides just take up another minion spot, which might be a good thing if you're looking for specific cards. Next up, we have the Mage specific, which is a secret, because, of course it has to be a secret. That's just very Mage-like, called Duplicate, and it says, whenever a friendly minion dies, put 2 copies of it into your hand. So this is a very interesting card in that it seems to be the first of the cards that we're going to be talking about that is supposed to interact with the new set, which is a very Death Rattle focused set. I feel a change was made a long time ago though, which will definitely make this card a lot harder to utilize in that you can no longer activate secrets on your own turn. Now what that means is that your opponent can try to play around this, and outside of some of the newer cards, I don't really see what minions and mage would really want to duplicate that isn't just going to be easier to get hexed or silenced. For example, Archmage Antonidas, you could try and play this and duplicate and hope and pray that they kill your Antonidas first. I feel like this will be very easy to play around though and very easy to check against unless you're only having 1 minion on the board, in which case it might present some nice opportunities to essentially make your opponent make the hard choice of whether or not they want to get rid of your Ragnaros if they don't have a hex or silence, or whether or not you just want to sit there and ignore it because you know that as soon as you get rid of it, they're going to have 2 of them. It'll be a nice insurance card. We'll see if it actually goes anywhere though. Up next, we have another secret for the Paladin called Avenge. Whenever one of your minions dies, give a friendly minion +3/+2. I don't really see a reason to take this over the other Paladin spell that you could use, which is Blessing of Might. Maybe you might want to take both, but the fact that you can't trigger this on your own turn, and the fact that you basically have to rely on your opponent being able to not play around essentially what is a secret, is... I don't really see how you could use this in a reliable Paladin deck. It does kind of make Paladin Secret a little bit more interesting, just because if you have, say, this out and the Noble Sacrifice, then you're essentially giving something a buff for free. I'm not sure if this is random, by the way. It could be targeted. The wording on the card is a little bit ambiguous. That being said, it could see some use in the current buff-heavy Paladin kind of deck, but I just don't see why you would want to take this for something that would be a little bit more reliable. It'll definitely be interesting if you want to have a secret-based Paladin deck, but overall I don't think it'll see any serious use. Moving on to the new priest card, we have the Dark Cultist, which has a death rattle, give a friendly minion +3 health. It's a 3-cost, 3/4. Again, not sure if these death rattles are targeted or not. That's going to be something you're going to be seeing a lot. So here's a card that I actually think is going to see a lot of use. For starters, it is a 3/4 for 3, which already stat-wise is a lot better than, or I think better than actually anything in the game right now for 3-cost stat-wise that doesn't have some sort of negative downside. And on top of that, when it dies, you get a nice little friendly buff. The fact it has 4 health on turn 3, it's going to be really difficult to deal with a lot of early game cards, and especially a lot of removal like Wrath and Hammer of Justice. Going to have trouble getting rid of this. And once it dies, you can buff up something that's going to be a lot more important to you, say your Northshire Cleric, just for example, and just essentially the minions that priests are pretty famous for. And then you can keep healing them up with your hero power and just go pretty strong into the mid game. I think it'll open up a lot of options for priest in terms of just being able to do more of the early game instead of sitting around and waiting for your bigger minions to come out and build up. So it'll definitely be a pickup that I think you'll be seeing in a lot of priest decks, and just generally probably be a very reliable card. Up next, we have a new rogue minion, Anubar Ambusher. I guarantee I did not pronounce that correctly. It is a 4-cost, 5/5 with a death rattle. Return a friendly minion to your hand. The first thing I want to point out about this card is it has better stats than the Yeti. And that's kind of a big deal to me, to be honest, because the Yeti is considered one of the best cards that you can get vanilla, which means that if your opponent has a Yeti and then you play this, you're just going to be able to straight up trade with a Yeti for nothing. And that itself is a pretty big deal. However, the death rattle seems like it could be a pretty big downside, but I feel like you could definitely play around this death rattle, especially in, say, a combo-centered deck with a lot of SI7 agents, maybe some preparations, backstabs, just generally low-cost rogue stuff that would play around this well and still be able to use the stats. All in all, though, I think that Miracle Rogue is popular for a reason. It'll be interesting to see if this card can be used in a different kind of rogue deck that is more combo-focused and less about just drawing a bunch of cards. The stats are definitely nothing to laugh at, but it'll be very interesting to see whether or not rogues can actually use this death rattle as a benefit, or whether or not it's going to be something that the person playing the card is just going to have to learn to work around in order to get the best out of the stats. Up next, we have the new Shaman spell, Reincarnation. Destroy a minion, then return it back to life with full health. I think this card essentially says that if you want to go hog wild with all of the new cards that are coming out, Shaman's pretty much going to be the go-to class to do that. For starters, it synergizes very well with Ancestral Spirit, which is another card that Shaman has, which essentially lets you choose a minion and gives it a death rattle that brings it back to the battlefield after it dies. No, I don't know how that's going to interact with the card that's coming out. Maybe it'll summon 2 copies, maybe it'll summon 1. I don't know. But essentially, this is just going to mean that you can trigger death rattles whenever you want, and since the expansion is related to death rattle, it's going to essentially be a free card to get what you want and kill off whatever you need to in order to get the benefit. It'll be interesting to see whether or not it'll be worth it in the long run, and that's going to be more of a discussion about the cards that are coming out themselves, but this card will let you play around with that and basically just go and do whatever you want to with the new cards. Up next, we have a new Warlock card, Voidcaller, which has a death rattle. Put a demon from your hand into the battlefield. It is a 4-cost for 3/4. Up front, I just want to say the stats on this card are not amazing. However, this seems to be an attempt to try and get everyone to stop playing Zoo, and that's always a good thing. Warlock has a lot of cards like Pit Lord and Succubus, which aren't really played all that much because their costs are way too high for what you actually get out of them. The battle cries are very detrimental and often hurt you more than they actually help you. This is going to have a lot of potential with cards like Void Terror and Hellfire and just all the stuff Warlock has, which says, I'm going to hurt everything on the board, myself included. It'll let you play a lot of the more cost-intensive, high-stat cards Warlock has, maybe be able to get around it. I'm not sure if having a 3-4 for 4, though, is going to be worth that. The mana cost for this seems kind of high, and Zoo is just so strong right now. I'm not sure if this will be a worthy alternative, but it's a nice attempt, and it's a very interesting way to try and get a different style of Warlock to come out and really be shown and fleshed out. We'll see if it can be used to make some kind of deck valid around it, or if it'll just fall to the wayside and be another kind of gimmicky demonologist style Warlock deck that tries to use demons, which don't tend to work very well with each other. And lastly, for the class-specific cards, we have Death's Bite for the Warriors. Weapon, 4/2, with 4 mana cost. Death Rattle, deal 1 damage to all minions. This is going to be, I think, a very strong card. First off, it is the in-between between the Fiery War Axe and the Arcanite Reaper, 2 very powerful cards already, and the Death Rattle, deal 1 damage to all minions, synergizes very well with the Armor Smiths and just the general toys that Warrior has and likes to play with. You're giving up a little bit of power and a little bit of damage, but I don't think it's going to be too big of a deal because it's just going to synergize so well with everything that the Warrior's currently doing. Expect to see this in a lot of decks that are currently running the massive armor style of play, and all in all, I think this is a very scary card that I'm actually a little bit scared to see in play just because I'm going to have to start learning how to deal with it. We'll see exactly how strong it'll be, and time will tell. Maybe it won't be run because it'll be too many weapons, but the Death Rattle on this weapon I think is just so powerful for what the Warrior does that I don't see any reason you would not take this card. So that's it for the class-specific cards. A little bit underwhelming in my opinion, with a couple shining gems that are really going to improve the style of play of certain kinds of playstyles with the classes. I think, really, though, the meat of the focus has to be the all-class cards. These are going to be the cards that really change the course of the game and are just going to provide the most kind of flexibility in terms of what you can play with. I'm going to go ahead and go through these in order and cover the legendaries last, just because I feel like that's going to be the cards that have the most impact. The commons, rares, epics, etc. I definitely think will be useful, and there'll definitely be some reasons to use them. But all in all, I think the legendary is going to be the cards that everyone's really going to be focused on, and let's be honest, they're the most exciting cards to talk about, so we'll spend a little bit more time talking about those than, say, the common cards. So, jumping right in, we have our first card, a common Dancing Swords. It is a 4/4 for 3, with the Death Rattle that makes your opponent draw a card. Starting with the very first card, this is a very interesting one in that it has essentially a Death Rattle you don't want to have trigger, unless, of course, you're running a mill deck. Yeah, I see where they're going with that. So the concept behind a mill deck, for those of you who don't know, is the idea that essentially you try and make your opponent lose by overdrawing, drawing more cards than they can actually have, and going into fatigue and dying. Currently, there's not really a lot in the Hearthstone that can execute that kind of strategy effectively. There are some gimmicks that you can do with it that you might have fun with, but nothing that you really should be able to work with and get running. Dancing Sword seems like it's going to be pretty nice, and it's a card that I'm personally kind of excited to actually try and get my hands on, because not only is it a nice card with nice stats, but if you're trying to run that kind of strategy, it's going to give you a nice mid-game option to kind of defend, and you can try and clone it, and should be able to destroy it yourself, and just essentially make a bunch of troublesome minions on the board that helps further your goal to just make your opponent draw more cards than they can essentially have. It'll be nice with cards like King Mukla, etc., and create some interesting play where you're basically just trying to get your opponent to draw as many cards as they can, which admittedly does provide them some options, which is one of the inherent flaws with trying to mill in Hearthstone. As for seeing this in non-milling play, I don't think it'll be seen that much. It has very nice stats, yes, but I think the idea of giving your opponent an extra card is a really big deal. It's the reason you don't see Naturalize run, and that only costs 1. So a minion, I don't really see it being taking too much thought to exclude this really from your deck. Hopefully, though, this really creates some interesting play with Mill, and I really can't wait to get my hands on it and just play around with it in some new styles of decks, and just completely ruin ladder and not really do much of anything useful. But it'll be fun, and hopefully this paves the way for useful milling decks that actually have some sort of viability. Next is the Haunted Creeper. It is a 2-cost 1/2 with the Death Rattle, summon 2 1/1 Spectral Spiders. I don't think there's really much to say about this card. I personally don't think it's a good card. 1/2 for 2 is, I mean, basically nothing, and yeah, you do get 2 1/1s, but 1/1s are pretty easy to deal with and very easy to ignore. You might trade for something eventually, but all in all, I just don't think this card has enough board presence to really be relevant to anything. Maybe there's something I'm not seeing here, but I just don't think it's a very good card, so we're just going to move right on away from this. Next up, we have the Mad Scientist, a 2-cost 2/2 with Death Rattle. Put a secret from your deck into the battlefield. This is a very interesting card. It's pretty lacking stat-wise, but the effect is really good if you're running a secrets deck. I mean, you're essentially getting a 3-cost card, since most secrets cost 3 unless you're running Paladin, for 2 mana, and you're getting a 2/2 minion on top of it. It's a little bit random, and I'm not certain if the secrets you get are limited, so I don't know if it takes it out of your deck or if it just places a copy so you can still draw the secret later. If you can draw the secret later, that would be some interesting play you could set up there. But it'll definitely be a nice way to accelerate secrets decks and make them a lot more reliable in terms of how fast you can get the secrets out and be able to just mess with the minds of your opponents. Secrets themselves, though, the usefulness of those are up for debate, but this is definitely a nice addition to the secret arsenal and just being able to play whatever you need to. Again, the stats are a little bit lacking, but I think the card effect well makes up for this. This next card, Nerubar Weblord, is another card I'm fairly certain I am not going to pronounce correctly. It is a 2-cost 1/4 with the effect that minions that have a battle cry cost 2 more. This card is fairly situational. It might be good against certain decks that like to run a lot of battlecry cards. I personally don't see this being used too much, but it's a very good card to have in case the meta switches to a very battlecry heavy style of play. I don't really see it being used too much unless you're running a deck that doesn't have a lot of battlecry, but even then the stats are kind of lacking. 1 attack is basically nothing, and 4 health is not impossible to deal with, and on a 2-cost minion, it's not going to really be the end of the world. It still trades pretty evenly. I don't see too much use out of this card, but I do see some scenarios where this card would shine. Up next, we have the Spectral Knight, a 5-cost 4/6 minion that cannot be targeted by spells or hero powers. Man, I really like this card. It might be a little less powerful than I'm imagining it to be, but the ability to have a 6-health minion that doesn't have taunt, which means that essentially you can use it however you want, which removal cannot deal with, is a pretty big deal. I do see the problem that this can't be buffed up directly, but I'm wondering if there's a way to maybe try and buff this card indirectly with certain kind of decks. It's very interesting, and the only other comparison I can really make to it is Fairy Dragon, which is a very nice 3/2 a lot of people take, and then the other Dream card, whose name I cannot think of right now. All in all, I think this is going to be a very nice card. The attack of 4 might be a little low, but it's essentially a Yeti that costs 1 more, has 1 more health, and has a pretty awesome effect that forces your opponent to have to make trades on the board. It will be a little bit susceptible to some of the bigger AoEs, but I mean, the 6 health is just so nice to have, and 4 attack isn't really anything to laugh at. It's not huge, but it can swing it around, and it'll probably be very nice for trading 2 for 1 at minimum. We'll see exactly whether or not that's the case, but I think this is going to be a very good card that a lot of people are going to be putting into their decks. Next on the list, we have Stoneskin Gargoyle, a 3-cost minion with a 1 attack and 4 health stat lineup. And it has the effect that at the start of your turn, restore this minion to full health. I'm not really liking this card a lot. The effect is definitely interesting, although one important thing to point out is that the effect happens at the start of your turn, which means that it's going to be a full turn before you see anything using really any kind of effect. You could buff it, I guess, but your opponent, if they have an answer to this card, can pretty much just kill it in one turn if you decide not to buff it. It might be good in some priest decks, or maybe even a couple paladin decks with buffs, but most people will carry answers to that kind of stuff anyways. That doesn't really just involve tackling something over the course of a couple turns. I feel like, even though the effect is interesting, so many trades are made right now in the game just in one turn that this is going to be a card that's not going to see a lot of mileage. Up next we have the Undertaker, a 1-cost minion, 1/2, that has the effect of whenever you summon a minion with Death Rattle, gain +1/+1. So a direct comparison can be made with this card and Questing Adventure, and that the Undertaker is really a more specific Questing Adventure that you admittedly can get out a little bit earlier. I think this is going to be like the Secret Creeper kind of card, where if you're running a deck that has this theme, there's really no reason that you shouldn't be taking this card, but any kind of deck that is really suited to be played more seriously, I don't think it's going to be very seriously. There isn't really any sort of reason I would see that you would not take Questing Adventure over this in a sort of just build-up style deck. It is pretty cheap, and you get it out pretty quickly, but in the end, that's not really what you want to be doing with your early game. You want to be setting up dominance, and you want to be just trying to take board control so that you can set the tempo and kind of do what you want. If you're playing this on turn 1 and your opponent has any sort of card that they can be playing, you're already going to be playing from behind, and you basically have to play 2 cards to get out a nice 3 attack, 4 health minion, which would be pretty nice, but it's not going to be very likely that on turn 2, after playing a turn 1 Undertaker, you'd be able to do that. And late game, you would just be better off playing a Questing Adventure, which benefits from every card instead of just Death Rattle cards, which are pretty situational and don't really account for spells either. So, kind of underwhelming, but not necessarily the worst card if you want to go and build yourself a nice Death Rattle themed deck. Next, we have the Unstable Ghoul, a 2-cost minion, 1/3, taunts Death Rattle, deal 1 damage to all minions, also known as Abomination's little brother. I actually think this is going to be seeing a lot of use in rogue decks because there's just so many nice cards that you can use for removal, like Phantom Knife, Shivs, with some nice card draw, and this will be a nice setup for that. Again, though, like many cards in this set, the stats are not necessarily the best, but I think in this case it doesn't matter as much because this is going to be seen mainly in decks that are trying to set up some early control and are playing more for the mid and late game. It'll be nice against a lot of minion spam heavy decks, especially Zoo, and all in all, it seems to be pretty useful and will definitely have some utility in a lot of our earlier cards, especially with the Rogue and maybe even some mage cards like Arcane Explosion. And then there's Zombie Chow. 1-cost, 2/3, Death Rattle, restore 5 health to the enemy hero. Is there anything I do like about this card? I don't think there's any strategies that really revolve around healing your opponent to death. If you want a card with 2 attack, you're gonna want to take a Worgen. 2/3 is not really the best stat-wise. I don't see where you could use this card. It just has a very bad Death Rattle that you don't want to use. I suppose that 5 health early game doesn't really matter, but I mean, what happens when you're playing mid or late game and this is the card that you draw into? It's just dead space. I don't really see what this could even be used for other than some really mediocre stats. Maybe it could have some use in the priest deck where you are reversing healing, but even then that's relying on another card to make this card good. I think this is easily one of the worst cards that are in this set. I could be completely wrong. I could not know what I'm talking about, but I don't understand why you would ever want to take this card over, let's say, Worgen Infiltrator or Leper Gnome. It just boggles my mind. 3 health is not that big of a deal because most people are playing with 3/2s, and 3/2s are more than capable of trading, especially if you're going to give the enemy health for it. And now we come to our very first rare. We have the Death Lord, a 3-cost dramatically named card with 2 attack, 8 health, taunt, and a death rattle, which reads that your opponent gets to put a minion from their deck into the battlefield. I'm assuming that's random, because if you could choose, that would be extremely broken and no one would take it. 8 health on turn 3 is a lot. Even for cards that are carrying removal, this is essentially... I mean, it has more health than the Morgashon Warden, which I believe is a 1/7 for 4, and really does a great job at stalling, but the Death Rattle is just so scary. I mean, what happens when your opponent finally managed to kill this card, and they say summon a Ragnaros, or they summon just some insanely hard to deal with problem. I mean, it's not statistically likely to happen, but you're just setting up for that. And the Death Lord will give you a lot of room to set up something. If you really have a strategy that you think is going to work best in the early or mid game, this is going to be a pretty decent card, I think, to take. But if you let this thing die and you have not just utilized all 8 of those health points and just setting up for whatever it is that you want to do, you're going to be in for a potentially rough time. Other than that, though, it's a nice card. It's not one of the best cards, but it has some utility, and in the end, I think that's what really makes a good card, in that it just provides options to you as for things that you can do. They may not be the best options that you can have in every scenario, but I do think this card has some potential in being built into some very unique decks that just center around setting up a early game that your opponent just cannot deal with, even if they do manage to get their scariest minion out on the board from this card's Death Rattle. It'll be very interesting to see if this card can actually be used, or if it'll just be like the Mana Golem, in that the Death Rattle scares too many people away from actually using it. Next on this list, we have the Nerubian Egg, a card that was shown very early and has a lot of hype behind it, and I think for good reason. It's a 2-cost minion, 0/2, and it has the Death Rattle. Summon a 4/4 Nerubian. Now, I think this card is probably one of the best cards to synergize with the cards that are currently being released, in that essentially it's a Death Rattle that A, you want to activate, B, you want to activate as many times as possible, which relates to the legendary, which we'll get to later, and C, you can clone fairly easily and even set up basically some pretty good trades with it. You can buff it and trade and make your opponent essentially have to trade with it, and then get a 4/4 out of it as well. Or you can just clone it as many times as you would like to, so that as soon as they all die, you're going to be having a nice little army at your disposal. I think this card has a lot of potential. I think there's a lot of playing around that can be done with this. I don't really know if it's going to be viable or not, just because of how much can be done with this card. I'm not certain if any decks will really be able to utilize this, but I do think we will be seeing some decks where this card is pretty much a staple, and it'll be very interesting to see exactly what kind of strategies form out with this, and more to the point, what kind of counter strategies come around this. I think this card will have an impact on the meta, and I do think that there will be essentially a lot of things that people are going to be trying to do with this card. Whether or not it's going to be something that we see affect the long term or not, I'm not sure, but I have a feeling that this will be something that you're going to see a lot of. And now for the next rare, we have the Sludge Belcher. Probably not somebody that you want to invite to dinner parties. He is a 5-cost mana, 3/5 minion with taunts, and has the Death Rattle, which will summon another 1/2 slime, which also has taunt. This is a little different from anything else that we have in the game currently, in that essentially it works a lot like a Harvest Golem, in that it replaces itself when it dies, but it's replacing itself with a taunt, and it's already a taunt, so this is going to be pretty effective at stopping, I think, rush decks, and just generally being able to protect something for more than one life. I really don't know what this card can do in the game, and I don't know what direction it's going to be taking. It's definitely a very different approach from a lot of the other Death Rattles I've seen, which replace themselves, and I think will be pretty useful for stalling and just protecting certain setup strategies that you want to try and execute. And now we come to the Wailing Soul, another rare 4-cost. It is a 3/5, which means it is below the standard stats that you would have for that mana cost. And the battle cry is to silence your other minions. I don't think there's enough cards in the game to really work with this one, to be honest. It definitely has some obvious use with Watcher decks, and some of the death rattles in this set that is going to be released are going to be pretty negative, and you might want to, silence those and make sure they don't go off. But in general, I don't see that as a reason to take this card. I think there are better ways to play around cards with negative abilities, and in the few times that you might want to silence your own minions, then I just think it would be better for you to carry an actual silence so that you can target that one minion instead of just nuking everything that you have, for better or worse. I don't see a reason you would take this card unless you're doing something really specific with Watchers, but even then, that just requires you to have such a specific combination of cards that I don't think you're going to be getting often enough to make this really usable. And I don't know, maybe it'll have some sort of play in the future if more cards are released that you might want to deal with. Most of the stuff that negatively impacts you, though, is Battle Cry and not Death Rattle, which I think is the main thing that you wouldn't be silencing besides, say, Watchers. I just don't see this one working. And now we come to the first of our two epics, which is the Echoing Ooze. It is a 2-cost minion, 1/2, and has the battle cry of summon an exact copy of this minion at the end of the turn. I'm assuming it's only for that one time, but you can Brewmaster it, and you can probably Shadow Step it, so it does have some setup. This is a pretty interesting card, in that it's basically its own faceless manipulator. But the catch is, you have to set it up yourself. You have to buff it, and give it all sorts of crazy stuff like Cold Blood, or Blessing of Kings, or whatever buffs you might happen to have available, and then you essentially get a second one for free. I think it's a little bit more powerful than Faceless Manipulator in the right kind of deck, because you're able to create something strong early, and you're able to create 2 of them. I don't think it's as powerful as Faceless Manipulator in that you can't really copy anything that your opponent has you might want, but it's definitely a very strong early game card that you might want to take over, say, anything else that would be pretty much a good candidate for buffing, except, I don't know, maybe Wind Fury, but Wind Furies tend to be pretty weak in the health department, and you only get one of them. It'll definitely be pretty exciting to see exactly what strategies come around this card. I do think this is going to be a card that gets seen a lot, but I'm not sure if it's really going to be all that reliable, because you are counting on that card to be buffed up with, but I think it'll be a nice addition to many of the existing decks that essentially rely on buffing up really small minions to ludicrous degrees. And for the second epic, we have the Shade of Naxxramas. It is a 3-cost 2/2 with stealth, and at the start of your turn, it always gains +1/+1. I don't really know what to think of this card, to be honest. It's kind of like a low-maintenance questing adventurer in that you don't really get as much out of it, but it's very low risk, it has stealth, and it builds up to a pretty respectable amount. I feel like, though, it's not going to keep pace in the game, in that when you get to turn 4, it's going to be a 3/3. When you get to turn 5, it's going to be a 4/4, and just stat-wise, it's always going to kind of be behind what it should be if you just played a normal creature. It does have that potential of really late game just coming out and completely destroying, but you have to really wait a long time for that to happen, and it is stealthed, so the possibility of just being able to get it to the point where your opponent cannot deal with it, and just always having that ticking time bomb, and that if they ever let their guard down and it gets to a point where it can just completely knock them in the face and just win you the game, it's nice. But at the same time, I feel like there's more that you could do, but it's a very interesting card. I'm not sure if it's going to be viable or not, because the ability to just be able to look at long games and say, hey, if you make this go for too long, I will just straight up hit you for 12, 13, 14, or whatever it's sitting on, is kind of a big deal. But I feel like most games kind of end before that, and you don't really want to be basing your entire strategy around that. That being said, with some of the other cards in this set, such as the taunts that replace themselves, and just the various stalling decks, I am wondering if maybe this will have some kind of potential to really work well, especially with some buffs. But I don't know. It's very different, and in the same sense that Gruul wasn't a really huge success, I don't think this will be seen too often, but coming with stealth is definitely a very nice bonus. And now we get to the legendaries. Let's go ahead and kick this right off the bat. Let's just dive straight into our first legendary, which I probably will not pronounce correctly. I'm not going to pronounce any of these correctly, so just don't even pretend like I will. We're going to start with Baron Rivendare. It is a 4-cost legendary minion, 1/7, with the effect of your minions having their death rattle trigger twice. So, as of this release, there are around 25 cards in the game right now that have death rattle. That's including the cards that are going to be released, and that is including very class-specific cards. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting things that can be done with this legendary card. It's definitely a very fun one. It's one that was designed more to just kind of appeal to combos and setups and just really being able to play around what you can do necessarily. I think there are going to be some pretty valid strategies that come out of this card, namely with the Trents that are coming out, especially Soul of the Forest. I think you're going to see this card in a lot of Druid decks that are going to rely a little bit more on spamming minions. And if you can get this off and then you can play Soul of the Forest, or maybe just play Soul of the Forest and then play into this, if they don't answer that, that's going to be a really hard thing to deal with, especially with the new Druid card that came out. You're also going to have to worry about things like Tyrion, like Sylvanas Windrunner, and even just really small, kind of subtle effects like Leper Gnomes, and being able to draw 2 cards with the Loot Hoarder. I think this card is going to be very fun to play around with. I'm not exactly certain as to how viable it'll be, but I do think there will be some decks that definitely get to see some use out of this, and can set up some really powerful combos. That being said, this is a card that's very weak to silence, and if you're going to be doing something with this card and a really good deck, I think you're going to have to be able to set up and kill your own minions pretty quickly, which might not be that easy to do with some of the more powerful things this card could be used for. That being said, it is also a very early card that you can play for 4 mana, so if you play this card, and it's pretty much a guaranteed silence, I believe, or removal in my honest opinion, that can set you up for something more powerful later, but in the end, that's not really what you want a card to be used for, and I think that most decks that are going to benefit from this are going to have some pretty solid strategies that kind of revolve around this, but also have some interesting secondary ideas going alongside of them. Hopefully we get to see a lot of really wacky things happen, where essentially something dies and then just a huge span of effects come out. I mean, I think that's what really everyone envisions when they see this card, just being able to have one thing happen and set off a chain reaction of death rattles, of just stuff going crazy. Whether or not that'll be easy enough to set up and actually be usable, I don't know. I feel like it is, but it's definitely going to need some tweaking and playing around to really find that right balance and use it in a deck that's going to really benefit from this effect. For this next legendary, we're actually going to cheat a little bit. We're going to discuss 3 legendaries because really these cards were essentially just meant to be played together. We have ourselves Fugan, Stalag, and Thaddeus. I'm not even trying anymore. It's just gibberish. So essentially what these cards do is provide you with a 7/4 and a 4/7 inversely stat-wise for 5 mana, and have the effect that if both of them have died, then you get to summon yourself a really beefy 11/11, and this sets up some very interesting combinations. The very first and obvious weakness is that, of course, you have to have both of these and play them to get the 11/11, so I think for the most part, it's, very impressive and stat-wise to have a creature that big. I don't think it's going to be something you can reliably play with, but I mean, that being said, I think that these 2 minions are actually pretty good on their own stat-wise. 7/4 is a little bit weak to basically anything around that cost, and can hit pretty hard, but doesn't actually survive that well. 4/7 isn't really something I think we've seen, and if you just look at the vanilla stats of these cards, they're pretty interesting, and I think the dynamic of having to take both of them in the deck will really help kind of push the idea of having a more heavy-hitting creature with some beefier ones on the side. I don't think you can really reliably use these to get off the death rattle. I think it's still a pretty nice bonus that'll be pretty cool to see play out when it happens, but I think that over the course of a game, it's very likely your opponent's going to have an answer to that and be able to remove it without actually killing it. But it's still a pretty cool effect, and I don't want to downplay the death rattle on this too much, especially. I actually wonder if you trigger this twice, if that counts for 2 summons of the creature on the same turn. That'll be interesting to see. Regardless, I think the most important thing to take away from these 2 minions is that it's offering a very unique stat combination that I don't think any other creature currently has. And that could potentially set up for some pretty interesting ideas in terms of the way that deck works and just open up a new kind of curve for you to play around with. Up next, we have what's probably going to be one of my favorite legendaries, Kalthazud. It is an 8 cost with an unpronounced name, 6 attack, 8 mana, that has the effect of, at the end of your turn, summon all friendly minions that died this turn. I think one of the most important things to note about this card is that his effect is not a battle cry. His effect is going to occur at the end of every single one of your turns, which basically means that if you have a way of killing off your own minions in a way that would benefit you, things are going to spiral out of control really quickly, and it's a late game card, meaning that there's a pretty solid chance that your opponent might not have an answer to this. All in all, this is of course going to be really hard to set up for, and the cost is pretty much there. It's also a really nice indirect answer to Naxxramas, in that you can essentially have a couple minions out on the field and he can just sit there and kill them all day, and you won't care because it's going to be coming back anyways, and it's not like you needed it there to begin with. You can also make a bunch of little tokens and just kind of ruin your opponent's day with them, and while I don't think this card is going to be overly popular in the long run, I just really like the effect, and I think there's going to be some very good potential of creating some extremely powerful, if really rare and hard to set up situations where essentially you just have this board that the opponent literally cannot deal with, and even if they manage to somehow clear your board or make efficient trades, it doesn't matter to them because of the fact that you can just keep replacing anything you have that dies. And this card has 8 health, so it's not going to be the easiest thing to knock over, which means that if they don't have a way of knocking it over, then, well, this card is going to solidify your lead if you have one. But that being said, if you don't really have much of a lead, it's going to be difficult to use this card, which is why I don't think it's going to be overly viable in most decks, but the effect is just so cool, and it just really captures my imagination as to exactly what kind of decks can be made with this, and how exactly you can benefit the ability to just regenerate every minion you've lost every single turn. And there's got to be some way that can be utilized and just completely broken and bent over. Time will tell, though, if it actually happens. And next up we have what's probably going to be one of the best legendaries in this set, to be honest. Loatheb. It is a 5-cost, 5/5 minion with the battle cry that enemy spells cost 5 more next turn. This card's going to be pretty ridiculous for stalling anything that's not a minion-focused deck, because this card can be Shadow Step, this card can be Brewmastered, this card is going to be off the walls crazy for just delaying any sort of deck that relies a lot on spells, whether it be Delay Mage, whether it be AoE, whether it be Miracle Rogue, or just... It's going to be seeing a lot of use, I think. It's a very powerful card. It's not the end-all for these kind of decks, but the effect is so strong, and it's something that you can't silence or get rid of either. Once this minion gets laid down on the board, that's it. It's on the board, and you have to deal with the effect of not having any spells next turn unless you really got lucky on some nice, low-cost efficient stuff. And even the stats are nice, so if you want to try and put this in a deck where you just keep bouncing it back and forth from your hand, you can attack with it, trade something, and then probably still be able to Shadow Step it or Brewmaster it next turn, and just preserve it and keep delaying anything your opponent can do with spells. I think this is a really good card that's going to see a lot of use in very specific decks that are a lot more minion oriented and don't rely as much on spells. It's going to be very anti-control. It's going to be very anti basically anything, and just to help solidify your lead when you need it most in some kind of deck that relies very much on having a full board and utilizing the space that your minions give you. I don't really know what else to say about this card. I think it's a very good card, and I think it's going to be seeing a lot of use in a lot of different styles of play. And hopefully it doesn't become a card that I hate, but for now, it seems like a very good, very interesting, very well done card that I'm going to very much appreciate having and just seeing and watching people play with. As long as people still use spells, because you know, those are cards that I kind of want to keep around. And lastly, we have Naxxramas. It has a name, okay? It's a 6-cost, 2/8 beast with the effect of destroy any minion that is damaged by this minion. So it is a beast, which means that this will probably be used in some hunter decks, but I think all in all, this is a card we've seen before. It's, you know, got an effect that's already on a good amount of cards, and the most important thing to note about this is that it actually has a lot of health, which isn't typically what you see with these kind of cards. I think the closest we ever see to come to that is Emperor Cobra. So this might see a lot of use in priest decks. This might see some use in beast decks, just because it's a beast and, you know, hunters like those. But I think the high health amount is definitely something that's going to be troublesome to deal with if you can keep it up and just be able to hit minions with it. I think it'll help encourage a little bit stronger minions to make sure that you can actually trade and get rid of this card, because it can just essentially eat anything with low attack all day long. But all in all, it seems like a pretty balanced, pretty solid card that has the problems with silence and hex that a lot of really powerful effects always seem to have, because, you know, that's what silences do. I like it though. It's a very control-oriented minion with a lot of health that can really back up what its effect does, and isn't just going to be something you use one time to kill a pretty tough to get rid of creature. It's something that you can try and use reliably and use over and over again to just keep a hold of the board and really eat through any of the smaller creatures that your opponent can lay down, assuming that you can actually keep it alive for a long period of time. But even if you can't, it's still probably going to trade pretty well. It is a 6-cost, so it's a little tricky to get out, and not necessarily something that you're always going to want to have over, say, a Sunwalker or anything else around that cost. But it's nice, and I think it's a nice addition to a lot of the cards that hover around that mana cost. So there you have it. That's my thoughts on the Curse of Naxxramas expansion. It's hopefully a nice, useful overview with a little bit of opinions thrown in here and there willy-nilly. I hope that this covers a lot of the cards that are going to be coming out and what they do, and doesn't leave with any more questions that you might have. I'm pretty excited about this card release, to be honest, and I'm hoping that I can get a lot of mileage out of some of the effects that are going to be shown here. I don't really want to keep you too much longer. The release of this video actually is going to be pretty close to the release of the expansion, so in the likely event that you're watching this video after the fact, I hope that this is a nice summary of all the cards that were released, and hopefully you can go and test out some of the effects for yourselves. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, I hope it was useful, and I hope it provided some information that'll help you in constructing your decks and coming to understand what some of the cards that are going to be released actually do. Now go out there and go collect yourself some new cards.